There is a moment, not a dramatic one, not the kind that gets marked in memory as the turning point, where something inside you simply stops moving toward what used to pull it. No decision, no announcement, no morning where you woke up and chose to be different. Just a quiet subtraction, almost imperceptible, like the way a room cools when a window has been left open somewhere in the house, and you only notice when the cold has already settled into your shoulders. You don't notice it happening to you. And that's the part nobody really talks about. Most conversations about this kind of change begin at the other end, with impact, with reaction, with what the other person finally understood when the familiar signal stopped arriving. But that framing skips the part that actually matters, which is what happens on the inside before any of that. The internal rearrangement that precedes the external silence. The thing that shifts before anyone else can see it shift. And if you felt it, not performed it, not strategized it, but genuinely felt it, then you know it doesn't feel like power. Not at first. It feels more like something close to exhaustion that has crossed a threshold and become something else on the other side. In a relationship where one person had been the one to reach out, to repair, to soften the edges of every conflict before they could harden, something eventually stops. Not with a conversation, not with a declaration. The reaching just doesn't happen one day and then another day, and the person who used to wait for it starts to feel the shape of what was always there but never visible, the structure of a dynamic that only worked because one side kept feeding it. That's what this is about. Not the silence as strategy, not the absence as message, but what actually happens inside the person who stops sustaining something they had been sustaining for a very long time, and what that stopping reveals about the structure beneath. Because there is something underneath. There always is, and it tends to be clearer than anyone is comfortable admitting. If what you just read landed somewhere specific, somewhere in the body, not just in the mind, then stay. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of examination. Not the version that tells you what to do, but the version that tries to be honest about what's actually happening. There's a lot to go through. The first thing people want to believe, and this is understandable because the alternative is harder to sit with, is that there was a moment, a specific moment where someone examined the situation, weighed the cost, and decided no more. A clean line, a conscious withdrawal, the kind of story that has structure and intention, and a person who is clearly in control of their own internal life. That story is almost never what actually happened. What actually happened is harder to locate. It doesn't have a timestamp. Think about the kind of friendship where one side has always been the one to reach out, every plan, every check-in, every repair after a silence that stretched too long. There is no morning where that person wakes up and chooses distance. The specific feeling of the dynamic just stops generating the same pull. It lands differently, not as a decision, more like a door that has been opening and closing for so long that one day it simply doesn't open anymore, and nobody announces this, and the hinges don't make a sound. Exhaustion has a quality that most people misread, including the person experiencing it. It starts as something you feel in the effort, the reaching, the explaining, the holding of space that nobody asked you to hold but that would collapse without you. And then at some point, the effort stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like something else entirely. Like absence of sensation, where sensation used to be. Somewhere before the thought forms, before any language attaches to what's happening, something has already stopped leaning forward. This is what gets mistaken for a decision. The stillness that follows, the external non-movement that looks from the outside, like someone who has made up their mind. What that process leaves behind, if you examine it honestly, doesn't feel like resolve. It doesn't feel like strategy. It feels more like the aftermath of something that quietly ran its course while you were still showing up to it. The myth of the conscious choice is seductive because it grants dignity to the person who stopped. It means they were in control. It means the silence was intentional. Maybe it was in some cases. But in most cases, and this is the part worth sitting with, the silence came first, and the understanding of why came much later, if at all. There is a version of silence that is a weapon. Everyone knows this version. It's the silence that arrives after a conflict with its arms crossed, that stretches deliberately past the point of comfort, that is maintained with enough awareness of the other person's discomfort to qualify as a kind of pressure. That silence has an audience built into it. It is performed even when nobody is watching, because the performer is always watching themselves. That is not what this is about. The confusion between these two things, strategic silence and genuine withdrawal, is responsible for more misreading than almost anything else in the territory of human dynamics. And the misreading goes in both directions. The person who has genuinely withdrawn gets accused of playing games. The person who is playing games gets credited with depth they don't have, and everyone involved ends up responding to something that isn't actually there, which means nothing that follows can be accurate. Someone stops calling, stops remembering the dates, stops being the one who drove the distance, after years of being the only one who did. On the other side, the interpretation that almost always forms is that this person is making a point, that the absence is calibrated, that somewhere, consciously, a decision was made to withdraw in a way that would be felt. The sensation that registers for the person who stopped is almost never that clean. It's closer to the quality of something that has been running at a low frequency for so long that the body simply stopped generating the signal. Not performance, depletion, but the myth persists. The myth that silence is always a message, because it's easier to be the recipient of a message than the recipient of an absence. A message implies that the sender is still engaged, still oriented toward you, still thinking about you enough to construct a communication even if that communication is made of nothing. An absence that comes from genuine internal withdrawal means something different and less comfortable, that the orientation itself has shifted, that you are no longer the reference point, that the silence has no audience and was not designed for one. This is where the misreading becomes consequential, because if you believe the silence is a message, you respond to it as a message. You decode it, you wait for the next signal, you calibrate your own behavior in relation to what you think is being communicated. And the person who has genuinely withdrawn, who has no strategy, who is not monitoring your response, who is simply no longer sustaining something that depleted them, that person becomes, in your interpretation, a chess player making deliberate moves. You assign intention where there was only exhaustion. You assign calculation where there was only the residue of a process that finished without ceremony. Both people end up eventually living in different realities. One is responding to a game that isn't being played. The other is somewhere else entirely, not thinking about the board. In a romantic context, this dynamic produces some of the most disorienting experiences people describe. The feeling of reaching towards someone who seems to be calculating something, only to discover later that they weren't calculating at all, that the distance was not manufactured but arrived at, that the space between you expanded not because they pulled away intentionally, but because something in them stopped filling it. That realization lands differently than the realization that you were being manipulated. It doesn't produce anger in the same way. It produces something quieter and harder to name, something that stays in the hours after, when the mind is still trying to locate the move that was made and finding nothing there. The myth that silence is always strategic is in the end a kind of narcissism, not in the clinical sense, but in the ordinary human sense of placing yourself at the center of someone else's internal process, of assuming that their absence is organized around you, responds to you, is aimed at you. Sometimes it is. But the version that does the most invisible damage is the version where it isn't, where the withdrawal was internal and complete and had nothing to do with sending a signal. And the person who didn't receive the signal spent months or years decoding a message that was never written. The romanticization happens fast. Someone stops absorbing the weight of a dynamic that was costing them more than anyone could see from the outside, and immediately the narrative that forms sometimes in their own mind, sometimes in the minds of people watching, is one of strength, of someone who finally had enough, of a person who stood firm where others would have kept giving. The image is almost heroic, and it feels good to inhabit it, and that feeling should probably be the first warning sign. Seneca wrote that there is nothing brave about enduring what you have no choice but to endure, and the inverse is equally true. There is nothing particularly strong about stopping what has become impossible to continue. The stopping is real, the relief is real, but strength is not quite the right word for it, and using that word too quickly covers over something that deserves a closer look. A person who has spent years absorbing every difficulty, every cancellation, every conversation that circles back to the same point without moving, when they finally stop, the quality of what they feel in the weeks after is not, in most honest accounts, the sensation of power. It's closer to the residue of something that has been running at a cost for too long. What arrives in the body is more like the aftermath of effort than the arrival of capability. What surfaces, when they actually examine it, is closer to relief that something depleted has been allowed to stop than to the clarity of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why. The myth of strength serves a function. It makes the withdrawal feel earned, deliberate, correct, and maybe it was correct. That's almost beside the point. The point is that framing it as strength misrepresents the internal process and, more importantly, prevents the more useful question from forming, not whether you were strong enough to stop, but what the sustaining of that dynamic was doing to you and how long it had been doing it before the sensation that something was wrong became impossible to ignore. That question is harder and more honest and leads somewhere that the strength narrative never does. What the other person understands is almost never what actually happened. This is not a criticism, it's closer to a structural observation about how interpretation works when the information available is primarily the absence of something. The human mind, when confronted with a gap where a signal used to be, does not sit quietly with the uncertainty. It fills the gap. It constructs a narrative from whatever materials are available, past behavior, self-referential assumptions, the story that makes the most sense given what the person already believed about themselves and about you. And that constructed narrative is almost always wrong. Not because people are poor interpreters, but because the raw material they're working with is incomplete in a very specific way. They can see that the signal stopped. They cannot see why. In a long-term relationship context, when one person's pattern of reaching out simply ceases, no argument, no declared rupture, just the gradual disappearance of the initiating behavior, what the other person tends to construct is a story organized around their own experience of the dynamic. If they felt secure in the relationship, the absence registers as threat, and the story becomes one of wrongdoing, something they did, something they said, a specific moment that must have been the turning point. They search for it. They replay interactions, looking for the sensation that something went wrong. They may find something that fits and decide that's the cause, even if it had nothing to do with the internal process that was already underway long before that moment. If they felt less secure, the story that forms is different but equally inaccurate in its own way. The absence confirms what they already suspected, that they were not valued, that this was inevitable, that the withdrawal is proof of something they had been anxious about for months. The specific feeling of that confirmation is not relief exactly, but something close to a terrible kind of recognition. The sensation that arrives is a fear being validated, which the mind often mistakes for clarity. Neither story corresponds to what actually happened inside the person who stopped. And this is the part that rarely gets examined. The gap between the internal process and its external interpretation is not a communication failure that better words could fix. It's a structural feature of how one person's internal reorganization appears from the outside. From the inside, the process has texture and duration and a quality that built over time. From the outside, it appears as a change in behavior, and behavior is the only data available. Marcus Aurelius observed, with the particular dryness that makes his writing still feel contemporary, that very little of what disturbs us is the thing itself. Most of it is the judgment we construct about the thing. The absence is not the disturbance. The story built around the absence is, and that story is assembled with whatever tools the interpreter has available, which means it reflects the interpreter at least as much as it reflects the person who withdrew. What this produces practically is that the other person is not responding to you. They are responding to their version of you, filtered through their interpretation of your absence, organized around what that absence means to them. This is always true to some degree in human interaction, but it becomes especially visible when the information gap is large, when the only thing being communicated is the cessation of something that used to be there. In a family context, this produces some of the most entrenched misreadings. A parent who stops receiving calls from an adult child doesn't have access to the years of accumulated internal experience that preceded the silence. They have the silence, and whatever story they construct to make sense of it, and that story tends to be organized around the parent's own understanding of the relationship rather than the child's. The quality of what the child was absorbing, the specific sensation of each interaction that cost something without appearing to cost anything, none of that is visible. What's visible is the gap, and the gap gets filled. The myth that the other person will understand what the absence means is seductive, because it assumes that the weight of the withdrawal will somehow communicate the weight of what preceded it, that the silence will carry, intact, the texture of the experience that produced it. It doesn't. It arrives as information that the other person then processes through their own apparatus, producing a reading that is shaped by them far more than by you. And what surfaces on the other side is rarely the thing you would have wanted them to understand. If understanding was ever part of it at all, which if the first two myths hold, it probably wasn't. Stopping is not the same as changing. This distinction is obvious when stated plainly and almost invisible in the middle of living it. The person who finally stops sustaining a dynamic that was costing them, who withdraws, who ceases to initiate, who allows the structure to collapse under its own asymmetry, often experiences something that feels, for a period, like resolution. The specific feeling of not having to reach anymore has a quality of its own. The body goes quieter than it was, and that quiet gets misread as evidence that something fundamental has shifted. Sometimes it has. But more often, what has shifted is the context, not the pattern. In a professional context, when someone exits a dynamic where they had been absorbing an unreasonable amount of invisible labor, the emotional maintenance, the conflict smoothing, the perpetual adjustment to other people's instability, and moves into a new environment, the pattern tends to reassemble within months. Not because the person is weak or unaware, but because the internal structure that made that role feel necessary, or at least familiar, is still there. The sensation that surfaces is usually a mild confusion. How did I end up here again? The residue of the previous dynamic is present in the way they enter the new one. The same quality of attentiveness to others' states. The same threshold for tolerating imbalance before naming it. The same delay between what the body knows and what the mind is willing to act on. The myth of resolution through withdrawal is partly a myth of location. The belief that the pattern lives in the relationship rather than in the person. That removing yourself from the specific context removes you from the pattern. This is almost never entirely true, and in some cases, it's not true at all. It reassembles, not in the same form, the context looks different, but with the same internal logic, quietly reorganizing the new situation around familiar grooves. And because the new context doesn't look like the old one, and because the person has the recent experience of having exited something which feels like evidence of growth, the reformation of the same structure happens without the alarm bells that might otherwise sound. The pattern is internal. That arrives as a sensation before it arrives as a conclusion. The sensation that something is reconstituting itself tends to arrive before the explicit recognition does. A quality of effort that is starting to feel familiar. A specific feeling of adjusting too much, too automatically. But the mind, still processing the last withdrawal as achievement, is slow to name what the body has already registered. And so the window for earlier intervention, the moment when the pattern is visible but not yet load-bearing, closes before anyone reaches for it. You don't know when it happened. That's the part that tends to arrive later, quietly, as a kind of secondary disorientation after the primary one has settled. Most people, when they try to locate the moment of internal shift, the actual crossing of the threshold, the specific point at which something stopped being sustainable and became something they were simply no longer doing, cannot find it. They can find the aftermath. They can find evidence in retrospect that the shift had already occurred by a certain date. But the moment itself is opaque, and this opacity is not a failure of self-awareness. It's a feature of how this particular kind of internal process moves. It doesn't move like a decision. Decisions have a before and an after, and the person who makes them is present at the boundary between the two. This moves more like weather, the specific feeling of a change in pressure that you only recognize fully once it has already settled into a different state. Somewhere in the body, the adjustment was registered before any conscious apparatus had access to it. That internal registration isn't always legible in real time. Sometimes it only becomes legible in retrospect, when you look back and notice that you stopped doing a thing approximately 3 months before you understood that you had stopped. You try to explain to someone or to yourself when you knew it was over. The honest answer almost every time is later than I should have and earlier than I realized. The specific sensation of having already crossed a threshold while still appearing, from the outside and sometimes from the inside, to be fully present. That sensation is not dramatic. It gives no signal. It has a quality closer to a gradual dimming than to a rupture, and this is where the difference between deciding and perceiving becomes consequential. Deciding implies agency at the moment of change. Perceiving implies that the change had already occurred, and the mind is arriving late to a process the body had already completed. Most accounts of internal reorganization, if examined honestly, which requires more patience than most people extend to their own experience, turn out to be perception rather than decision. The recognition arrives after the fact. You perceived that you had stopped. You did not decide to stop and then stop. What this implies about self-knowledge is uncomfortable. It suggests that a significant portion of internal change happens below the level at which we monitor ourselves, and that the narrative of conscious navigation, the story of someone who saw clearly and acted accordingly, is often assembled after the fact from evidence that was not available in real time. The residue of that process is genuine. The clarity that comes later is genuine. But the clarity was not present at the moment. It would have been most useful, and admitting that change is the kind of credit or responsibility that can honestly be claimed for what happened. The difference is not visible from the outside. That's the first thing to understand, and also the thing that makes the whole territory so easy to misread, both by observers and by the person living it. A performance of detachment and a genuine internal reorganization can look identical for a significant stretch of time. Both produce the same external stillness. Both result in the cessation of reaching behavior. Both are followed by a period in which the other person escalates, recalibrates, or withdraws in turn. The surface in both cases offers no reliable information about what is happening beneath it, and yet the two processes are almost entirely different in texture, in duration, and in what they leave behind. The performance has an audience. It may be hidden, internal, never spoken aloud, but it is there, present in the quality of attention the person pays to the other side, a quality that is monitoring, that is checking, even if quietly, whether the silence is being felt, whether the absence is registering, whether the dynamic is shifting in the direction the withdrawal was intended to produce. The specific feeling of performing detachment is not peaceful. It has an orientation. Somewhere in the body it is still turned toward the other person, still measuring the distance between them, still invested in what the distance is doing. The genuine reorganization has no audience. This is, and I'm not entirely sure this is the clearest way to put it, but this is the defining feature, the one that holds when everything else is stripped away. When the internal shift is real, there is nothing being monitored. The sensation that registers in the hours after is not the anticipation of response. It is something quieter and less directed. The body is no longer oriented toward the gap the other person occupies. The mind is no longer constructing scenarios about what they are experiencing in your absence. What the dynamic left is still there. That kind of thing takes time to clear, but the active investment in its continuation or resolution is gone. In a friendship context, this distinction becomes visible over time, rather than immediately. The person who performed detachment eventually breaks the silence, or manufactures a reason to re-engage, or finds that the not engaging requires more maintenance than the engaging did. The orientation was always still there, sustaining the performance from underneath. The person whose reorganization was genuine does not experience the silence as effortful. A quality settles that is less about restraint and more about the absence of the pull that would need to be restrained. They are not holding themselves back. There is simply nothing moving them forward. In genuinely reorganized people, what becomes visible, and this is uncomfortable to name because it can sound like indifference, which it isn't exactly, is that the outcome on the other side stops being the referent for their internal state. Not because they don't care in some human sense about what happens, but because what happens on the other side has been decoupled internally from the thing they are monitoring. They are monitoring themselves, what their own internal state is doing, whether the pattern they were sustaining has actually changed or simply changed location, whether the quiet they are feeling is the quiet of something resolved or the quiet of something that has paused and will resume. That last question is not rhetorical, it is genuinely difficult, and the difficulty is the point. Because the difference between a pause and an ending, internally, is not always clear in the moment, and the person who is certain they have genuinely reorganized is often the person who has not yet tested that certainty against the next context that will try to reproduce the familiar structure. The body knows something, but what exactly does it know? And how much of what feels like completion is the specific sensation of a process that still has further to go? There is a particular quality to the moment when someone stops needing the other person to understand, not the performance of not needing the actual thing. It doesn't arrive with clarity. It doesn't feel like resolution. It feels, if anything, like a mild and disorienting absence of the familiar weight. The sensation that something which used to occupy significant internal space is no longer there, and the space has not yet been filled with anything else. And that emptiness is neither painful nor comfortable, but simply present. That is, as far as I can tell, what genuine reorganization feels like from the inside. Not triumph, not indifference, a quality that sits in the body without needing to be named or validated or witnessed by anyone. Most of what gets called Stoic detachment in popular conversation is not this. It is the performance of this, the maintenance of a posture that resembles this from the outside, sustained by an internal orientation that is still very much engaged with the other side, still invested in the outcome, still monitoring whether the absence is doing what the person hoped absence would do. The performance is exhausting in a way the real thing isn't. It requires sustained effort precisely because the pull is still there and must be actively resisted. The real thing requires no resistance because the pull has genuinely changed. In a self-reflective context, which is the context this entire examination has been pointing toward, quietly, from the beginning, the honest question is never whether you have achieved detachment. It is whether what you are calling detachment has an audience, whether the stillness you are inhabiting is still oriented toward someone, still measuring its own effect, still waiting for a signal from the other side that would confirm you have done the right thing by going quiet. Because if it is, if somewhere in the hours after, a part of you is still checking, then the reorganization is not yet what you think it is. And that's not a failure, That's information. What a long dynamic leaves behind doesn't clear because you've understood it intellectually. It clears, slowly and without announcement, as the internal structure that sustained it changes at a level that doesn't respond to comprehension alone. There is something worth naming about the difference between the person who has stopped and knows why, and the person who has stopped and is still assembling the explanation. Both are real. But the second version, the one where the stopping happened before the understanding arrived, is the one that tends to get passed over in silence, because it doesn't fit the story people want to tell about themselves. The story of clarity, of having seen something clearly and acted on it. That story is cleaner. It doesn't require you to admit that your own body was further along than your mind, for longer than you'd like to count. What the body carries after a long dynamic has ended is not always what the mind would have chosen to carry. There is the weight of the effort, the years of adjusting, absorbing, initiating, and that weight doesn't dissolve because the situation has changed. It lives in the way you enter the next thing, in the speed with which you read the room, in the threshold you set almost automatically for how much imbalance you will tolerate before naming it. Those thresholds were calibrated somewhere by something, and they don't reset simply because the context does. This is not a reason for despair. It's closer to a reason for patience with yourself, with the pace at which internal structures actually change, rather than the pace at which you understand them. Understanding is faster than changing. It always is. And the gap between the two, the period when you can see clearly what you are doing and still find yourself doing it, is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of how deep the structure goes. The examination this has been tracing, the internal shift, the misread silence, the myth of strength, the pattern that migrates, leads here. Not to a resolution, not to the sensation that something has been fixed, but to a clearer picture of what is actually happening when someone goes quiet, and what that quiet does and doesn't mean, and what would have to change, not in the behavior, but in the structure underneath, for the quiet to mean something different than it has meant before. If something in this examination has landed somewhere specific, if there's a quality to what you're sitting with that feels worth continuing to examine, subscribing helps more than it seems, like it should. Same with the like. Same with the comment. Speaking of which, if any part of this resonated, leave the word silent in the comments. Not as a label for what you're doing, as a way of marking that you recognized something in here that you hadn't quite found words for yet. And when the silence finally stops needing an audience, what do you notice in the space that remains?